gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. A couple of PSAs from me. You know what a PSA is, don't you? Public service announcement. You might have noticed on the bulletin, the announcement sheet that we hand out as you come in, a little bit different. I don't know if it's on the front side or the back side, but whatever side you call it, it's the blue box that has the little scrolly things. Did you notice that? If you might look at that. When you come into church and you sit down and you take a few moments before Mass begins to kind of put your mind in that place where it needs to be in order to celebrate and worship, you might think about asking yourself those two questions, because I've been doing this the last few weeks, and they really are there to help focus on the message for the day. And God has a really wonderful way of speaking to our hearts, and you know, sometimes we need a little help to listen, and that's what those questions are there for, to help you out. And you might have also noticed that there's like a little bit of extra space around them. Feel free, if you think about it, if you wish, to write down what you thought, what that thought comes in your mind. I know I like to do that myself when I can, because I typically forget the thoughts that I have, and then when I go back to saying, there was a thought I had about that, I forget what it was. So writing it down is always is a good thing. In fact, I was listening to Tom read the second reading, and even at the 8 o'clock Mass and yesterday at the 4 o'clock Mass, the thought I had about that reading was, it applies really perfect to something I'm going to say next week. I got to remember. What are the chances next week I'll remember or during the week when I kind of work on my homily again? Anyhow, so there's that. The second thing is, I really wanted to be here with you last week. I was on retreat the previous week out in California, as I told you 2 weeks ago, and I got on the plane. I was supposed to do a red eye from Los Angeles back here to Newark on Friday night. And I got on the plane and ready to go, and it's 11:15 flight, and it's 11:15, and then it's 11:30, and 11:45, and 12 o'clock, and 12:30, and 1 o'clock. And that's when the captain comes on and says, "Sorry, folks, the flight's canceled." And it wasn't because of the weather. It was because of a technical problem on the plane. So I didn't get to come home. Supposed to be home then Saturday night at midnight into Newark, and I did. We got into Newark on Saturday night at midnight, and it was pouring down rain, and I was exhausted, and I said, it's not safe for me to drive home. Not because of the weather, but because I was so tired. I was just really fearful that I would get into an accident, so I stayed in Newark. And that's why I wasn't here last week. I really did intend to be here. I'm very grateful to Father Ritz, who was available and able to cover for me. I hope you enjoyed him last week. We have the gospel today. It's really the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. And it's not the very beginning, but it's near the beginning. And it's near the beginning of his ministry that he says, and we hear it in the gospel, today the scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing. It's a great line. And it really kind of focuses what Jesus is all about and what he's offering. And it's simply freedom. That's what he has to offer you and I, freedom. Not the kind of freedom that you might think it is. It's not the freedom of the world. The freedom that allows you to blow through a stop sign if you feel like it, because sometimes that's what people think freedom is. I don't need to pay attention to that. Not that kind of freedom. It's a different freedom, a deeper freedom, a freedom that really gets to the heart, because it's a freedom that gives us the ability to choose rightly and to choose ultimately to respond to Jesus and follow him. The question that we need to ask is, do I want to be free? Go ahead, ask yourself that question in your mind right now. Do I want to be free? You remember the movie Fantasia? It was an animated movie that Disney did some years ago. Maybe some of you remember seeing it. They took segments of classical music and put animation to them. And there was one segment of the movie where they took a song and they put the story of the sorcerer's apprentice to it. And actually, from what I understand, it's just the opposite. they took the story and put music to it instead of putting the story to music. They had the story first and then the music. In other places, they had the music first and then the story. Anyhow, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Mickey Mouse, of course, is in the starring role as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. And you know, he's there with his sorcerer who has been doing all sorts of magical things and decides to go off to bed, leaving Mickey with the task of carrying these heavy buckets of water, a task which Mickey really would rather not do, a task from which he wishes to be free. And seeing the sorcerer go off to rest, he seizes the opportunity to use his fledgling abilities, his fledgling talents as a sorcerer, to animate a broom to do the job for him. And while the broom fills the cauldron with buckets of water, Mickey goes off and takes a nap, has a dream, and ultimately in the dream feels like he's drowning, only to be awakened to discover that indeed he was, because the broom had not stopped and the room was being flooded. Of course, Mickey tries with his abilities to stop the broom, and he can't, and so he picks up an axe and he chops the broom to splinters, and thus the title of this series, in an effort to stop it. And he does, and he breathes the sigh of relief. It's done. And that's when the music takes a turn, and it starts to build slowly and quietly and building, and we see the splinters of the broom start to reanimate into more and more and more brooms that are carrying more and more and more buckets of water, and soon Mickey's swimming for dear life in this deluge of water. Of course, it's not until the sorcerer shows up that he's able to calm the tempest and save the day. Isn't that oftentimes the story of our lives? We figure out that there's got to be an easier way to do something, to get the job done, and we get caught up in splinters, the small things, the little things of life, the small stories of our lives, which create all kinds of problems. We long for some way to calm the storm, but instead of turning to the one who can do that, we settle for what we believe is the best solution. We take out the axe, and the splinters come to life, and we're overwhelmed. They get us in trouble because splinters keep us focused on ourselves, on the small things, on the small stories of our lives. And those stories are more about the pain and the suffering and the troubles than they are anything else. They're about the shame and the pride and the control that we grasp a hold of, that we want so much to keep for ourselves, but ultimately realize they only cause more problems. And you know, splinters are merely little tiny slivers of wood, but boy, can they easily cause tremendous irritation and pain, and sometimes even go as far as to be infectious, creating even bigger problems. And then on the other hand, there's the gospel. It's no splinter, because it is the big story. It lays out for us the entirety of Jesus' ministry, what Jesus wants to accomplish, what he has to offer for me and you. To bring glad tidings to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. What are the glad tidings that you need Jesus to proclaim to you in your life right now? Especially in those places where you experience poverty, sadness, loneliness. What are the small stories that make you feel like a captive, where your sight might be limited and you long to be set free and be able to see? How are you oppressed by something or someone to the point that you feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders? You see, these questions are important. In fact, they get us to the deeper need that we all have for freedom, because they get to the heart of the gospel message, because the gospel is the answer to these questions, the answer to the deepest questions of our heart. As we sang in the psalm, your words, Lord, are spirit and life. On the other hand, we oftentimes want to forgo the answers, and it's not because we want to, but because Satan tricks us into foregoing the answers, because he tricks us to believe that the questions aren't even worth asking. He gets us to believe the lie that there is no answer to these questions, so why even ask them? But not only that, Satan wants us to believe the lie that the splinters of our lives, the troubles, the difficulties, the challenges that we all face are just too much for God to conquer. And besides that, they're too much for God to even be concerned about. That's the lie Satan wants you to believe. And the only solution really is to entrust yourself to Jesus, to his truth. That's what Peter did, in the end of the Gospel of John, where Jesus asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? And of course, Peter does, but what Jesus had to do was understand and adapt himself to Peter's limited capacity for the kind of love that Jesus was calling him to, the kind of love that he wants to give to you and me, a love that shows the way through the splinters and the small stories, the little things of our lives, to get us to the bigger picture, the picture that Jesus has in mind for you and us. Jesus wants and does adapt himself to our weaknesses. He accepts our weaknesses. In fact, he can use them for our benefit. Peter sought to imitate Jesus, but he couldn't. On his own, he couldn't, because he was incapable of the task. You and I on our own are incapable as well. And Jesus understands this and accepted Peter as he accepts you and I nonetheless, because he wants to lift Peter. He did lift Peter as he wants to lift you and I up and out of all of the stuff of life. He wants to lift us out of our troubles to a place where we live in his bigger picture, that plan he has for your life, for my life. And he does this preaching this message of freedom, because he knows it's the only way that life is going to make any sense. And when we follow this path of freedom, there's 2 things that we learn. First is the truth about ourselves, our weaknesses, our failings, our splinters. And the second is the truth about why we're here on this earth, to conform our lives to the one who can and does lift us to a greater life, to see the bigger picture. And getting to that bigger picture means moving away from that first truth, that truth that says we are weak, that we do fail, that we do have splinters, that we do need help. Every one of us. Not too long ago, someone said to me, Father, I really want to get closer to God. Can anybody identify with that? Pretty sure you all can, because that's why you're here. You want to get closer to God. The next sentence, though, was the real kicker, because he said to me, but there's some things that get in the way, and I just don't know how to get rid of them. It's kind of depressing. Can you identify with that one? I know I can. Well, over the coming weeks, we're going to look at some of these small stories, these little things, these splinters that really get in the way of life and cause all kinds of pain and suffering. The small stories that become the lie, that prevent us from living in the freedom and the joy, the truth that is Jesus Christ. We're going to look at what are known as 5 keys. Maybe a better way to say is 5 tweezers. Pull them splinters out. 5 keys that can unlock the door that keeps us bound to those small stories, the little things of life. Open that door so that we can walk in freedom and joy.